There's a certain nostalgia in speaking here today, as it was not too long ago, as Mike explained, that I was a student here. I was filling my Sundays with a mixture of learning and sports. But I also recall that when I was your age, I had the attention of a goldfish, so if somebody stood up to talk, I'd likely tune them out. So I'll try to be as brief as I can, but I do want to share a story from these Olympic Games with you that has a lesson which you can all learn from. So, as Mike explained, I spent just under 4 years dedicating every single day, over 10 to 12 hours per day, to trying to qualify Israel for the Olympic Games in skeleton. As Mike explained, in skeleton, you start from a dead sprint, you dive headfirst onto a lunch tray, you slide down the hill at 90 miles an hour with your chin about an inch from the ice. The person who reaches the bottom in one piece with the quickest time gets the gold medal. So there's two critical skills in skeleton that you need right off the bat. The first is a really good sprint. You need that initial velocity, that initial acceleration to propel you forward. The second is the ability to balance yourself on what is essentially a couple of centimeters of a rocking chair. I personally lacked both of these skills. I was an absolutely atrocious sprinter coming from hockey and suffered many injuries over the course of my 4 years trying to get better in sprinting with extremely poor mechanics. I also lacked balance. Every time I entered a corner, I would kink my body slightly to the right, as it wasn't until later that I found out, after a body scan, that I had a small curvature in my spine. So initially, I was told by the coaches, quote, that I would never be competitive in the sport, that I lacked the essential skills necessary. And when I heard that, it was my 23rd birthday, March 14th of 2014. I dedicated myself, at least for the next 2,884 days, that was 8 years at that point, to making sure that Israel qualified for the Olympic Games in skeleton. So a lot of you guys might think that the defining moment of my life would be qualifying or making the Olympics in skeleton. After all, I did only finish 28th of 30 athletes in the field. But actually, what I take the most pride in is the lessons that I learned on my way towards the Olympics and at the Olympics itself. I'm painfully aware as an athlete, as most of you are as well, that there's a lot of physical limitations that we have in life. Most of you would like to be 6'7". I also wanted to be 6'7" and dunk a basketball and make the NBA when I was a kid, but at some point you realize that that's actually just physically not possible for yourself. We're somewhat limited by our physical growth, but that stands in stark contrast to the intense personal growth that you can experience when you overcome adversity and personal limitations. So for me, the personal legacy of my journey was that, by most accounts, I should have quit many times. Not only should I have quit, but it would have been the right thing to do in many aspects. But every time I didn't quit, I experienced an intense growth spurt. So I have a story to share to you today, not about the times that I was training in foreign countries or about any of the victories that I experienced, but about 16 extremely tumultuous hours at the Olympic Games. So for those of you who watch me compete, especially on the screen over there, you might be perplexed as to why, when I crossed the finish line, I was pumping my fist so hard, seemingly in elation. But allow me to explain the circumstances of the 16 hours that had led up to that point and why I'd felt such pride when I crossed that finish line. In skeleton, the forces on the head are actually quite extreme. You experience 5 G-forces when you enter a corner, which is a lot like suspending a 45-pound weight plate directly from your neck. You experience in skeleton, for this reason, a lot of head impacts, very dangerous head impacts, and it can adversely affect your brain health. I myself experienced a worrisome number of head impacts, and when I saw a fellow athlete, experience a pretty severe concussion at a race in France during my Olympic season, I decided to do something about this. So I designed a system at great personal expense, a system to buffer the head against the sled using a helmet that was a little bit longer than normal. The chin was a little bit longer than normal. Over 2 months and multiple races, the helmet was deemed legal, and I was extremely satisfied. One of the more proud moments of my life, I was satisfied when I realized that the system worked. And not only did it worked extremely well. In the couple months before I had made this system, I had broken 3 visors as my face smashed into the ice. In the 2 months that I had raced with this system after inventing it, my helmet didn't come into contact with the ice once. I also took a significant risk in adopting the system during the Olympic year because it changed the entire dynamic of my sliding. As I mentioned before, balancing on the sled was incredibly difficult for me already, but adopting a completely new system where I had to situate myself on the sled to perfectly align my helmet was a unique challenge. When I traveled to the Olympic Games, everything seemed to be going extremely well. My training results were far better than I expected, and I was looking forward to putting in a really good showing for Israel. The Olympic Committee, for its part, was extremely excited as I was turning in some pretty good performances in training. But 20 minutes before the final training, the day before the Olympics, the Olympic event of which I competed in, my helmet was disqualified by a 3-person jury panel. The reasoning they gave lacked all sorts of any consistency, and the reasoning changed multiple times as I challenged the reasons as having no basis. But ultimately, there's nothing I can do. The emotions which hit me when my helmet was disqualified, it was an emotional torment. I can't really adequately explain it. It was a mixture of anger, confusion, fear, and sadness. I railed against what I thought was a complete miscarriage of justice, but my training, 20 minutes after this ruling, took an absolute nosedive. I had to switch out my helmet, and I lost all sense of where I was on the sled. So I went ping-ponging around the track. As you guys may have seen on the runs, I took some pretty significant, I went airborne in one of the runs. But physically it was quite painful because my jaw started to hit my sled now. But emotionally it was far worse. My hopes for a good showing seemingly evaporated, replaced by fear of finishing last. And indeed, in the training, I slipped to last. I immediately lost 2 seconds on my run. There was a fear of embarrassing Israel, but it wasn't until later that evening that I had heard that it was another athlete who thought that by disqualifying my helmet, he could ruin my performance and enhance his standing. And so, initially, this confusion that I'd had of why me, why at this point, why was this system, which was so good, why was it not being acknowledged, was replaced by this anger, this really intense, hot anger that stood to really ruin the entire experience of the games. I was angry at him. Why would some athlete pull such a petty and cheap stunt? I was angry at the jury. Why would they bend over backwards to seemingly disqualify something which had real good impact? But more paralyzingly, I felt this intense fear of letting Israel down. It was beyond anything I've ever experienced in life. I've broken more ribs than I have known that I physically had. And every time I got back on the sled, there was always the element of fear of continuing to damage your body. But this fear was unlike any other fear I've ever felt. There was the potential future of my federation potentially hinged on this performance. Funding for future athletes hinged on this performance. I was the first sliding sport Olympian in our country. Millions of people would be watching the next day, and so everything, all I had thought about that evening as I sat in a shipping container at the track, as the luge event went on outside of the shipping container, I just sat there, I stared at a wall, was, I'm going to blow it. I'm going to blow it, I'm going to finish last. Israel's never going to send another sliding sport Olympian. It's over. But that evening, I got 2 calls. One was from my friend John. He's a fellow Australian Olympic athlete. He told me of a similar circumstance at his first Olympic Games in Sochi. And he said that all of these fears, all of these doubts, they're external. And you can think about them. You can have a real fear of falling short of expectations, of missing, let's say for you guys, the final shot in the basketball game. Right? The team puts the ball in your hands. as my country put the ball in my hands. And you can have that fear of missing the shot, but all of those considerations are external. And internally, you can really dig deep and overcome that with whatever personal growth that you can experience. And what you can experience is a limited amount of personal growth. My brother Alex, my older brother, called me and dispensed some terrific advice that helped me find that internal strength to overcome. So what I had realized that night, sitting in that shipping container, I literally sat there for hours. It's extremely bitterly cold, but I sat there for hours, and I finally realized that I was my country's first sliding sport Olympian, and that the next day, no matter what I did, I would earn the title of Olympic athlete. But I could be the Olympic athlete who showed up, phoned it in, came in last, and went home, or I could put in a showing that was worthy of the confidence that my country had put in me, and walk away with a really proud showing. So when you guys have these fears, these external doubts that are pressed upon you, you should realize, as I did, that the only reason that you have these fears, the only reason that the fears are there to begin with, is because you are in a position, a very competent position, to maneuver yourself into a situation for which those fears are presented. The ball is in your hands at the end of the game because you can score. You're in the game because you can play. For me, I had qualified my country. The only reason I was at the Olympics is because I could perform. I was not an Olympian because of a system that I invented 2 months before. I was at the Olympics because for 4 years, I spent over 10,000 hours, almost every single moment of my waking day, trying to make sure that Israel qualified for the games. And so what legacy would I leave the next day? The next day, a journey that started with my complete inability to sprint effectively my runs began with the best pushes, the best sprints that I had pushed in those 4 years, and I crossed the finish line knocking off those 2 seconds that I had lost the previous day. And so I did. I pumped my fists really hard, even though I came down in 28th place. I felt like that for us was a personal goal, because I'd overcome it's a ridiculous situation, but I'd overcome those fears and doubts to actually put in a performance that was worthy of Israel being at the Olympic Games. So I hope whenever you guys face the uncertainty of either falling short of the expectations that you feel have been pressed on you, whether it's on the court or outside of the court, maybe applying to schools you might not feel that you might get into the schools that you were expected to, or any of the other personal obligations that you have, you realize that the only reasons that you had those obligations to begin with, the only reason that those pressures are there to begin with, is because you yourself had the qualities that allowed those obligations to come into play. So dig deep, experience that personal confidence, and put in performances that make you proud of yourself and that leave a lasting legacy for those who come after. Thank you guys for having me here today.